Welcome to Pop and Play, the podcast all about play in its many silly, serious, and powerful forms. I'm Haeny
And I'm Nathan Holbert. And in this season, we're talking all about young people's media, how to make it, why it matters, what participation looks like, and its many challenges and limitations.
And today we're talking with Aaron Trammell, Associate Professor of Informatics at UC Irvine. Aaron has recently published 2 books on play, titled Repairing Play, A Black Phenomenology, and The Privilege of Play. Both books challenge the prevailing narrative of play as a shiny and happy space.
Yeah, it's a great conversation where we really get into what it means to play in various communities and spaces, and the ways in which the games and the narratives and the world building really contribute to who participates, how they participate, what kinds of conversations emerge around play.
Yep.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and looks at the dangers and risks and complexity of engaging in such play. Yeah, so let's get into it.
Let's talk about it. I'm curious, in your own experiences, you and I have talked a lot about kind of the different ways in which we played when we were younger. Mm-hmm. Are there any things you can recall from your childhood where you engaged in play in a certain way, or you wanted to engage in play in a certain way, and there was a tension there or a difficulty there?
Yeah. So I think growing up, I feel like the thing that I was really, really trying to do is have people forget that I'm a little Asian girl. Okay. And so I figured there had to be ways to hide that or make that less visible. So I really tried hard to fit in. Okay. And so one of my first examples is when I was a kid and little, my parents actually bought me this dress up set, which is actually very, I don't remember getting a lot of things when I was little, but I definitely wanted that.
Yeah.
And so it had like fake plastic high heels, like whatever, earrings, whatever, all that stuff. So I really wanted to get it. And I think the reason why I wanted to get it was I wanted to bring it to school, instantly show everyone that I had it.
Yeah, of course.
And then I wanted to give it to them. Okay. And
Wait, what?
Yes. And so I just distributed all of these things that I just got.
Oh my God.
Okay. Because one, I wanted the visibility of having something that I think everybody else has.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to have the power to distribute that to other people.
Wow.
Right? So I feel like that was actually sad when I think about it.
It's a little sad.
And I also feel like my Asianness and my smallness is never going to be invisible.
Right.
Like I'm never going to be able to hide that.
Yeah.
But I actually did a lot of things where I tried to do that.
Totally. It's kind of amazing when I think back about the ways in which the games or the toys or the things that we played with, or that I played with, are so much about how I needed to fit in.
Yeah.
I certainly didn't have the same experience as you in that I wasn't a small Asian girl in a predominantly white community.
Yes.
I did grow up in a predominantly white community, and I do recall in my very small neighborhood, my very small school, I think there was like 30, 40 people in each class. I mean, it's small in each grade. So you had to play sports. Like sports were the only way you could be kind of in the community. And so I really played sports a lot, and I wanted to play sports a lot. But I distinctly remember that things that weren't jock adjacent, really wanting to get involved in, but knowing I couldn't get involved in them, or couldn't let anyone know that I was involved with them, because it would just be a social, it crushed my social life. Not that I had a social life, but that was the sense.
Yeah.
And so I may have talked about this on the pod before, but I was very secretive about playing video games. My closest friends and I played video games together, certainly, but I didn't ever talk about it at school because I didn't want anyone to know that I was a nerd who played video games, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think those issues of belonging and how it's so adjacent and related to play.
Yeah.
Right? Like there is something that happens in play and community and a sense of wanting to be a part of something, right? That happens with play. And I just think about even the objects that I shared, right? It's not a community.
It kind of is though, right? There's a meta community around it.
Yes, there's a meta community, but there is an official, all the people that love dress up, come here.
Come here, we'll have a party together.
We'll have a dress up party. Although that is cosplay, right?
That probably did happen too.
Yeah, but
we just weren't invited.
But there isn't an official community to it, but there is this circulating set of things that these artifacts kind of convey, right? And these communities and groups that have access to that, right? And so I think a lot of times, like, you know, now that I'm thinking about like why we want to talk to Aaron about this, it's this idea that like those things are not necessarily innocuous, right? That there's issues of access, there's identity politics in it, there's like ways that certain children are made to feel because they don't have something or they don't have access to something, and it really is kind of a privilege to sort of be able to mediate and be part of these communities.
Yeah. We got a lot to talk to.
We got a lot to talk about. Let's get into it.
Let's get to it.
We have with us Aaron Trammell, who I have an equally long introduction for because fandom, fan communities. That's how you know I'm a fan, is long introductions.
Long intros.
Basically.
Yeah, perfect.
You're making me blush.
Aaron Trammell is an associate professor of informatics at UC Irvine. He is interested in how tabletop games furthers the values of white privilege and hegemonic masculinity in geek cultures. We often think about play as joy and happiness, but it can be many things all at once, both joyful, but also tense, violent, traumatic, and a lot of times exclusionary. He attends to these ideas in a very, very excellent book called Repairing Play, A Black Phenomenology, which Nathan just finished reading, where he centers the playing communities of Black, Indigenous, people of color. Alongside this book, he also has another one called The Privilege of Play, which looks at the history of games and race in the 20th century. He has a third book coming out, which Nathan is very, very excited about, which is Designing Dragons, Quantifying Fantasy in Dungeons and Dragons. Will be available late 2025.
You had me at dragons.
Look, I'm not opposed to dragons either. I like them. So welcome, Aaron.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you here today. We are going to dig into your work, talk about play, talk about communities around play, but we always like to start with a bit of a game to just kind of loosen us up and get us into the conversation. And so for you, I've designed a game as an expert on tabletop games. I did. I'm a game designer. No big deal.
I feel like I'm getting the white glove experience here. Nice.
But yeah, I came up with a game. You're an expert at tabletop games, and you know, we've heard you talk. We've read your work, and you're an expert at really kind of the expansive world of games that are out there. And so I thought what I would do is ask you about the really boring old classic games. And
boring. That's debatable.
Some of them are not so great. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a scenario where you've invited people to your home or to some place of fellowship, and you need to figure out which classic board game is the right game for this particular group of people.
Okay. I can do that.
I will give you multiple choice, but you should feel free to go off script and choose whatever you think is the perfect game for this group of people.
Okay.
All right.
I'm down.
All right. So we're going to start with this. The University of California Irvine administration is coming over to your house for a party. Which game do you invite them all to play? Monopoly, Risk, Taboo, or Twister? Or if there's something else you'd prefer.
No, definitely not Twister. That's going to get dicey fast. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with Taboo. The chancellor of UC Irvine is a big free speech advocate. So I think of the games listed, going with Taboo and these taboo words that you're not supposed to say.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like that'd be kind of trolling him on the next level. So yeah, I think I'd go with Taboo on that list.
I mean, I also like the idea of just buzzing your university president with this buzzer and putting it in his ear and be like,
Haeney's coming over to your place, and so you need to choose a 2-player board game that you can crush her in. And here's the options I have for you, but of course, feel free to go rogue here. You can beat her in Battleship, Guess Who, Chess, or Scrabble.
Oh, wow.
Choose carefully.
This is a hard one.
Maybe she can beat you in these games. That's always a possibility, too.
I'm just kidding. Be honest.
Okay. Of that list of games, I mean, I want to play Scrabble because I think that's the game there that I enjoy the most, but I will definitely not crush somebody at Scrabble. But yeah, I think I'd do Guess Who. I think that would be the challenge game that I would choose if I had to face off against you. I've got a really good memory, so I think I'd be able to pull the rabbit out of the hat.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, very true.
That's good. All right, I want one more. You have all your college friends over, and they've had a bit too much to drink before this part of the evening, but they demand from you, as the game expert, that you entertain them with a new board game. So which game do you get out for your slightly inebriated friends? Do you get out Candyland, Sorry, Yahtzee, or Boggle?
Yahtzee. Boggle.
I get out Yahtzee.
Really?
Yeah, I think
love
I
Yahtzee.
think of that list of games, that's the best one actually. What were the first two again?
Candyland or Sorry?
Yeah, so Candyland. I mean, all of these games are pretty random, but so you don't really make choices in Candyland. You don't really make choices in Sorry, but you do make a choice in Yahtzee about the dice that you re-roll, and that's an interesting choice with some depth to it. And Boggle is there. I've met people who are just so good at Boggle, and they will just win every game. It's actually a very low randomness game, so there's a place where I think it stops being fun. So yeah, I think we play Yahtzee. But I feel like this is not a fun answer. Like I should be like, we're drunk, we're playing Sorry and yelling at each other. But
I mean, I love that you brought statistics.
Yeah. Talking about randomness.
Chance and choice into this.
Well, thank you for playing that game with us, Aaron. I really appreciate your answers, and I'm looking forward to a vicious battle of Guess Who down the road here.
I'll do it.
Bring it on.
Well, Aaron, we wanted to talk with you about your work. You've been doing some really excellent research around games and gaming communities, and specifically the ways in which the way we organize these communities can create and invite people in, and also can sometimes explicitly communicate who's not as welcome in these spaces. I wonder if you could talk a little bit though about your own experiences, as somebody who's been involved in games, and when you were a kid, were there particular gaming communities that you were drawn to? How did you participate? How did you choose to engage in these communities? Yeah,
that's a great question. And I think you all might know the answer a little bit, but when I was a kid, the coolest person, I think like the singular coolest person, like in my world, was my cousin. And so he'd always come over to the house with these cool games that he had been playing with his friends. And so he introduced me to all this really, really kind of cool, nerdy stuff, like Dungeons and Dragons and then Magic the Gathering. And then I would introduce these games to my friends
right.
who were like, oh, you're kind of
like Aaron's the coolest person I've ever met.
I mean, this is all relative. So we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons here. So, when when I'm like, hey guys, want to play some Dungeons and Dragons with me? We're all kind of nerdy in that space. So yeah, my cousin would often introduce these games to me, and then I would read the rules and obsess over them and convince my friends to play them with me, and it was a lot of fun. And that kind of got them into games also. And they'd introduce me to these other gaming spaces. My friend Paul in particular would seek out like Magic tournaments and stuff. So I think he was the person I knew who kind of introduced me to like the social worlds of gaming, whereas my cousin was like kind of the person who introduced me to the interesting like world of gaming and things. So that's with tabletop games. But I'll say like I also love video games. I just don't really write about them so much as tabletop games. And with video games, I had eye surgery when I was a little kid, like 4 years old.
Oh wow.
And my grandparents took pity on me because it's a lot for a kid to go through eye surgery. Mm-hmm. And so as I was coming back to getting my eyesight back, and it's really painful. They do surgery, you can't really see for a few days as you're like learning to adjust your eyes again. They bought me a Nintendo Entertainment System, which I thought was the coolest thing in the world.
Glorious.
And but even more important than that, they gave me, it was like almost like a magazine that had all of the games that were for sale, like almost the sort of thing that like a toy store would buy to figure out how they were going to stock the shelves with like screenshots of all the games. And there was like hundreds of games in it, each with like a quarter page kind of spread on it. And so I was flipping through this magazine as I was learning to play again. I was just like imagining these games, and honestly, games that I never ever got to play, most of them. But it just seems so exciting. And I think like from that early age, kind of coming out of that surgery, I was just like hooked. I was just like, I can't wait to play games.
This is who I am now.
Yeah, I am a boy who plays games.
Yeah. Just to clarify, so when you're talking about magic communities, you're not talking about like magic shows or magic tricks, right?
No. I'm talking about even worse, Magic the Gathering.
Yeah. So I want one of you to, I challenge you to give me like a 3-sentence summary on what Magic the Gathering is.
We have the expert here.
Yes.
Aaron, I think this is all you.
Well, okay. So in Magic the Gathering, you are a planeswalker, which is a person who is able to travel between universes. And you draw magic out from the world of 5 colors. White is the white magic, black is the dark magic, green is the nature magic, red has fire magic, and blue is a sort of like water magic, or this sort of tricky magic that exists. And so all of this is kind of symbolized in a bunch of cards in this game, and you summon creatures basically to kill your opponent. Yeah. I would say in reality, it's numbers and cards on a table, and you're doing some math, and
it's like Yahtzee.
In a way,
exactly
yes.
Like
yeah.
Exactly like Yahtzee. So you are somebody that plays it or that continues to do it in adulthood.
Yeah, I go to tournaments. I play it sometimes.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's great. I think that leads us to our next question about, so I do not go to these tournaments, but I actually do see them. And I think my image or visual sometimes of these conventions are that it ends up being very intergenerational, right? You see a lot of different people doing that, and you talk, a lot of gamers that I talk to talk about their childhood experience with that, but then can also talk about how it goes beyond this range that they were supposed to play games with, and I think that's actually a little different than toys, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm not playing with Barbies right now. There was a point where it feels like it's more temporal, right? And something like this seems to kind of move across generations. So can you talk about why you think that is the case, or what affordances does something like that engender in creating multi-generational connections?
Oh boy, I think you asked a bigger question than you were ready for, because there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff to unpack here. So I definitely think that is the case. So I think that observation you're making is absolutely true. And especially I really started going back to Magic events again like 2 or 3 years ago. I was actually really surprised. I expected a bunch of people who were probably 10, 15 years younger than me. And I actually met a lot of people who were my age, plus another generation and another generation beyond that. And so that was kind of interesting to see, and a real eye-opener about how hobbies are these sort of intergenerational affairs. And of course, like I do some work with Gen Con, which is a tabletop convention in Indianapolis every year. It's a really big one. And there, it's very much a family situation where often groups of friends will come, but you'll also see families bringing themselves and sharing the sort of joy of gaming with other people in an intergenerational way. So yeah, in that way, it's all very wholesome. It's exciting. It's seemingly cool. I do think there's some sketch things that happen though because of the intergenerational side of things, and so kind of dovetailing with my research on how play isn't always a positive thing. But I've definitely been to some like live action role play communities. These tend to be very intimate communities where everybody kind of knows each other. That's kind of one of the prerequisites for playing a lot of live action role play, is that you're pretty familiar with the other people at the table and or in the room, that you have a sense of trust, at least in a lot of communities. But there's these sort of weird bleed throughs in these communities to where it also becomes kind of like a social scene and a dating scene. And when you have something like a social and intergenerational dating scene, things can get a little weird sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I do think that's where you start seeing things. And I feel like weird might be the wrong word, as long as things are legal and consensual. but I definitely do feel like that's an unusual sort of way to socialize and meet people you might be interested in, is through games. But also that's a good thing that games are facilitating that. So it's an interesting kind of space in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me of last season when we had Alexis and Josh on. Remember, and they were talking about cosplay conventions.
Yep.
And they kind of brought up the same thing. Like they're going to these spaces, working really hard on their costumes to come, and they're very excited about the community and the building of it. And I think, and on the flip side, there's also like real issues of being in those spaces, like issues of harassment, right? Issues of gender and sexuality and things like that also play into it. And I think for them, they have to kind of balance like the pros of belonging with this community, and then the cons of, and that danger and that risk that comes with it.
Yeah, I think that the issue that happens in these spaces is that sometimes there's a person or several people who kind of engage in predatory behavior and take advantage of people who might be a little more naive about the world and stuff like that. So so I think that's you see some of the more concerning aspects of play coming out of those spaces, as well as the sort of community building, which is a really positive aspect, and I think a great thing that games really do.
I want that's a nice segue to another thing I really wanted to get into with you, was about this notion of community. This is something we talk a lot about, Haeny and I, on this podcast, and we talk about play, and we often are explicitly trying to engage in and understand new communities of people organized around play or pop culture, right? And as you've noted, like there's this really kind of wonderful, beautiful thing about community where you can have a group of people that you trust, that you feel safe in, that you feel like you can be yourself around. But there's this other aspect to community that I think you've written so beautifully about, where it is about defining who's in and who's out, right? And there's this we're the gamers, we're the cosplayers, we're the anime players, we're the Magic the Gathering crew. And that sense of defining that we're in and others are out is, I think, like you've noted, kind of a problematic, a potentially toxic part of this kind of way in which we build and create communities. I'm wondering, like, games and hobbies feel like they're really, really rich spaces for this. And I'm wondering, like, is there something specific about the games? Are there ways in which we can think about new models of community building or community, proliferation that can break us out of those mistakes?
Yeah. So again, this is a thing where I think a lot of things are happening. The group, often self-admittedly so, just is a little socially awkward. And right, like, so like, oh, welcome, have a chair, do you need a drink of water? Those things aren't the first thing that jump to everybody's mind, as much as like, oh, you're one of us, come sit down. We're playing the game and we might not even explain what we're doing. Well, leave it to you to ask those questions. And that can be very alienating from people, I think, from outside of these sort of niche geek communities. But I also think that that's one of the reasons that a lot of the folks in these communities are finding themselves and finding that to be a sort of constructive space, because it's like finding people who are like me, and might be a little socially awkward, but then at the same time, like, when you want to geek out really deep on this one topic, you've got some friends to really geek out really deep. And so I think that's one of the kind of aspects that's happening there. And then I'll because you asked, are games unique in this way? And I'll give you a different example from some of my very early research that wasn't on games. So this was a story that happened when I began grad school. The very first project I worked on was this theory that we had about sort of like information underground, quote unquote. A professor, I think he's at CUNY right now, Joe Sanchez, came up with this idea. And we looked into the punk scene in New Brunswick, New Jersey, to see how basically the kids were setting up shows and hiding their shows from the cops and stuff like that. And this was really cool. Like, I was a friend with a lot of people in the area. I was part of the scene, so I was, helping get informants to have these conversations. And it was just really exciting. It was, research. It was going to shows. It was a very cool project from the inside. But eventually we got, this one guy gave me a fanzine he had written that was getting distributed through the scene, and it was called What We Do Is Secret for a Reason. And it was basically a sort of pamphlet to help people who are new to the scene understand that, like, telling everybody you meet about what's happening was actually not good for the community's health.
Yeah.
Because then the police would know, like, oh, there's always a party here on Friday night. We'll just bust
Just
it
show up
up
and
at
bust
like
it,
8
yeah.
o'clock. And so that was kind of eye-opening to me about what the sort of world of gatekeeping and secrecy does on a level of community. I think, on the one hand, there are toxic elements that happen with gatekeeping for sure. And there's that element of keeping people out of networks, wealthy networks that might share what I call networks of privilege in my book that help people gain social advantages.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that for art to flourish and for communities to flourish, there do have to be secrets. There do have to be ways that the community identifies and knows itself and helps itself get along.
I mean, I definitely agree with that, because I was thinking even if you zoom out beyond a gaming community, right, that there's communities where having a shared affinity to one another, whether it's racial or whether it's gendered, whether it's an experience that you've had, whether it's around a trauma or violence, right, like that's a very important space to have for people.
Yeah.
And that having, like, not all communities are for everyone. Right. And not all communities have to be open to everybody.
Yeah.
Right? Because there are a set of conditions that make that space a special space for somebody.
Yeah,
and so I'm just thinking about that beyond just gaming. Like, I think about that with ethnicity and race, especially.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the trick to this. And this is a theme I think that runs through my work a little, is that, often we get locked into a conversation around purity and danger for ideas.
Right.
But I actually think that recognizing how complex, messy, and complicated the world is, and the lived experiences of people is key. For ethnographers listening, I know this is what you've been doing for decades.
No. This is the first time this has ever been suggested. I mean, I guess the part I would like to surface that, I mean, I 100% agree with all of this. And I think one thing that is important to recognize is that different people need different things at different times, and that's my philosophy. But I'm thinking about, like, there are, for certain communities, for certain groups of people, like, there is a need. We were talking about this earlier about kind of a space for healing, a space for like protection and safety. And then there's others, and I'll put my particular demographic on the line here. More white men need to experience things that are not just for white men, and they need to experience ideas, people's lives, people's values in a way that can sort of let them recognize that there's other ways to live in the world. There's other encounters that might be possible out there. And so kind of wrestling with this tension of community as the value of its potentially kind of closed nature, and the importance of, in some cases, really trying to expand community to be less about me versus them and more about, like, maybe it's us, maybe more of us that I didn't recognize. This person that lives in the neighborhood down the way, or the city next door, can also be kind of inclusive. And games and other communities can be really powerful for that, right?
Yeah. Well, I think for the white guys listening out there, first, I don't think that any community of color is ever going to say, like, we don't want white folks in it, but I do think it's more of a scaffolding situation. So, like, I don't know if you're maybe a white person who's only grown up in white communities, you met very few BIPOC folks in your life, make a friend and learn to trust that friend. And when you have that significant level of trust, I think that friend will probably introduce you to deeper kinds of community that might not have been accessible. But I do think that's kind of part of a natural sort of gatekeeping process there that keeps those communities safe, but also allows people to kind of acculturate in a way that's not assimilationist in how they're kind of entering a community.
Yeah, but what happens if people don't do that work and then come to the community because they like the thing? So I guess my larger question is, what happens when the community breaks down? And what do you do to kind of set up the conditions for, like, a real sense of community that attends to some of these racial, gendered dynamics?
So, just to be clear, when you say, like, when a community breaks down, you mean, like, because the community is no longer sort of...
Or, like, we all came here because we like Magic the Gathering, we don't care that much that people might say racist things to each other, or yeah, we came here because we like this shared artifact, which I think can be a real thing. Like people can connect over this shared artifact, but maybe we're not thinking about how it's gendered and non-inclusive of these other identities, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, well, I think that's, this, but I think that's a dilemma that people of color faced for a very long time, going into communities where sort of unfortunate things are being said in front of other people. And I actually think sticking it out can be its own kind of political and important statement in that regard, to not let it get to you. I feel like this is probably the most machismo I'm going to lean into with any perspective. But and I know that's not stands for everyone, but I do think that it can be important to let those people who are doing their own kind of gatekeeping know that maybe they have to be a little more accepting of someone new at the table and stuff like that, and to be willing to put yourself into that position, but not challenging. I would never ask for somebody to do that. So yeah, I do think that for people of color, that is its own challenge. And for those folks in the community that might be entering one of those spaces and trying to use hate speech or something like that, I'd say good luck. That seems like a poor decision. If I'm understanding that correctly. I think communities of color are fairly resilient in how they would manage that problem within themselves.
Maybe related to that, and maybe this is a question for both of you, like what would you like to see in gaming communities that would maybe interrupt or expand who gets to participate and who contributes?
Yeah, and I think that's a super good question, and I think it's one that developers are certainly starting to think about in a way that is relatively new for the game development community. I mean, it's always been happening on the fringes, but it's happening in the mainstream. Personally, I am like fully enjoying the fact that there are a lot more mainstream games that I wouldn't have that are allowing for representation and experiences and different kinds of people that are part of the stories and a part of the storytelling. I'm really enjoying that, and then being exposed to more kinds of games, more kinds of experiences, more kinds of people's lives. That the gaming community has not been super supportive of that, and pretty much any time a game comes out with a woman protagonist or a BIPOC protagonist, that there's an immediate negative reaction by many gamers. But that sucks, because I really enjoy that. Like, I really enjoy the fact that I can play a game like, oh, here's a new kind of character, here's a new kind of person with a different kind of experiences. Like,
yeah, like reset the norms.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I feel like my wish is metatextual. So like when you started talking about like review bombing and stuff like that with games, and for listeners, if you don't know what review bombing is, that's often this sort of trollish communities online. If a game comes out with like sort of representation they don't like maybe there's a queer main character or something like that, they will just, everybody in these communities will just put a 0 review score up so that the Metacritic site reads the game as worse than it actually is.
It's like Yelp.
Exactly. But it's coordinated by sort of nefarious and trollish groups online. And that's the sort of thing that I just wish would stop. It's just like, it's not helping anybody. It's not making better games. It's not pushing whatever weird political idea there is out there better. It's just making everybody's experience a lot rougher and kind of muddying the waters. And what it's inviting, and I think this is really the core of a lot of the problems of representation in games today, is a conversation about representation that essentializes. Because it's setting that as the argumentative stakes. It's saying like, well, this is, a woke queer game or whatever, because there's a woke protagonist, as if that games are woke or non-woke, and that's the binary, instead of a whole variety of stories that are being told in games. And so that's just not a really constructive sense of dialogue from my perspective. It's kind of soul crushing to think about in some ways. And I get really bummed out when I think about it. Not because I'm angry that the game has been review bombed. I actually probably couldn't care less if a game was review bombed or not, but because I feel like the stakes of that conversation are so disingenuous and not motivated by anything that's actually being represented in a game.
Right.
There's reviews are so they're so subjective and so socially constructed, and then it's also like oddly raced and gendered and has an ideological viewpoint and all of that. So
well, then you get into this thing especially when you talk about the coordinated efforts here, is then you get into this situation where a game comes out and let's say it's got a gay protagonist or something, and you have this whole host of people organizing to review bomb it and to talk about how this game must be terrible, and then you play it and you're like, it's actually a super mediocre game. But I can't really talk about it as being a mediocre game because that falls into this whole like meta debate that's not really about the game at all, right? And so it does not that I think games are the end all and that we should always be talking seriously about the games, but the meta conversations, like you said, Aaron, like it's not about the thing. It takes away the stakes. It takes away the actual core of the thing that we really want to be engaging with each other around, and instead it becomes these ideological battles. And that's a really frustrating thing.
It's like the perennial struggle for dominance and power exists in even reviews.
I mean, I actually think with games, reviews have long been kind of ground zero for said struggle. There's a lot of control there because you are the tastemaker when you're the reviewer, you're the critic. So
yeah, I want to switch gears just a tiny bit here and talk a little bit about world building. So whether that's video games or tabletop games or role playing, narrative type games, there's or even just fiction, right? There's all this kind of world building that we do to try to create the context. We create the people that might exist in these contexts, and historically in mainstream fantasy and mainstream sci-fi, this has been kind of a fraught space because there's times where the particulars of how the people who had the power, who were able to publish their stories and publish their books, got to project a certain set of expectations on the way the world should be organized, right? A classic example of this that I know you've written about is the way in D&D there are these like racial modifiers. If you're of this race, you have these extra points, and if you're of this race, you have these points.
Not anymore.
Right.
It's totally gone now.
Right. Yeah. So I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about that. So like on the one hand, what are some of the ways in which that's kind of played out perhaps in history, but also how are we thinking about that now, or how are you thinking about the ways in which world building can become part of who participates and how it feels to participate in those spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just talk about the D&D thing first, because you got me excited.
Yeah.
And you're like, talk about Dungeons & Dragons. I'm like, ooh, shiny object. So yeah, with Dungeons & Dragons, with the racial modifiers, I think they did two things. One was a little silly and one was pretty smart. So the silly thing was they've changed the conversation from race to a conversation about species. So no longer are characters in Dungeons and Dragons of different races. They're now of different species. I'll get into that in a second, and I think this will maybe eventually join into some thoughts about world building at the end of things. But so yeah, they talk about species instead of race in the rules now. But they had those modifier scores, which were a really fun game mechanic to play with, to be like, oh, my elf gets +2 intelligence or whatever. Completely racist and completely problematic, but it lent this sense of theme to the characters that players were building. And so now they've replaced that part with background. And I actually think that was a kind of brilliant thing. So, for example, if your character was a dock worker and that's your character's backstory, you'll probably be strong. And so I thought that was a really smart way to substitute out the racist part and substitute in, I think, something that's cultural and understandable, which is that we have these stories, these histories that we live with our lives, and those actually inform our physiology probably more than something like genetics does in most cases. So I really liked that change in the new books. But back to species, because I thought this was fascinating and really weird that they decided to use species instead of race. And I think I've trying to put my words to it has been kind of challenging, but I think the thing that I would say about that is it felt like a kind of a sidestep. It just felt like using a different word for the same thing. And at its worst, I also think that it sort of cools a conversation about race that's happening. And this is a sort of classic conservative maneuver, which is like, oh, people are getting upset. We're talking about race. Let's find a way not to talk about race, but still do the discrimination. And so I think that is definitely something that I'm not so cool with the species thing, because I actually think that having conversations about race in Dungeons and Dragons, even if they make people unhappy, are good, because the racism that's in the game is actually the racism that players bring into the game from their own lives. And in some ways, there's a forcing function there that some of these conversations do happen. And I actually think those are productive and useful conversations for people to have that allow people to understand each other better and to grow. And I know that's a hot take, because I feel like I'm saying like that sacred safe space of gameplay shouldn't be so safe, but I don't always believe that it should. I actually think that we need to get our hands dirty sometimes to understand the world around us and understand the depth of affect and emotion that's happening there. So to take, I think, this all back to world building, where we started, which is, I think that there is a corporate incentive for sure to do world building that is very inclusive. And I think that one of the affordances of that kind of world building, this sort of inclusive world building, which is important, bringing different people in, saying this is a safe franchise. You're not going to see like swastikas everywhere you're replaying this game. It's, you won't feel unsafe. But I also think, I do think that enabling some conversations around serious real world topics through the game is actually the mark that makes it art. When a game can do that, and do it with skill in a way that players can play and say like, hey, I see the beauty of the world or the diversity of the world actually reflect in this game, and that's beautiful. I think that's actually a really special thing.
Yeah, I mean, as I hear you talking, I'm thinking about how there is something to working through some of the difficulties or tensions or issues or questions that you might have with other people. Like I'm an early childhood person, so I often think about this with little kids too. Like we want to solve all their problems by like telling them exactly what to do or reprimanding them for something. And we don't sometimes let them work through some of the things that might be issues or problematic, because then they don't really know how to think through those things, because some adult took care of it for them instead, and so I really appreciate the idea of working through something. And I think sometimes we're like uncomfortable with difference. Like I think as soon as we see something different, we either want to ignore it or go this way or just fix it or deal with it. But that there is like a space to kind of grapple with some of these ideas of difference.
Totally. I think that's working through is a perfect way to describe what I was trying to explain. Is that games can be a space where that facilitates. It can be a relatively safe space, and that's really amazing that games can do that. But I think, again, we have to get away from these polemics in design that expect sort of like perfection and expect these smooth, pleasurable experiences that, frankly, really just serve corporations.
Well, thank you, Aaron. This was a very deep conversation.
I love it.
I'll take it there. That's my favorite place to take it.
I love it.
Into the deep. Thank you for this. We'd like to end with just a very simple question of what's poppin', which means what out in the pop culture landscape, books, media, video games, a new board game, anything that is out there that you're really excited about that you want other people to know about.
Oh man, what's poppin'? Yeah, so for me, Slay the Spire it's a video game and also now a board game, but I would say that's the game that's poppin' the most for me right now. I've been trying to play it a ton, but I don't know, like
good.
Just in general, like I guess on the pop culture level, I'm just really deeply into video essays on YouTube. I've learned so much from them, and I definitely enjoy watching and chilling with them. So I think that's this sort of quirky thing that's popping in my life.
Long form video essays.
Long form videos.
All right.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for spending time with us today, talking about your work, talking about games, talking about world building. It's been a real pleasure. We've already mentioned that you have these two excellent books that people should absolutely check out, right? Repairing Play and The Privilege of Play, and your new book.
Designing Dragons, which might get a different title eventually, but yeah, the new one will be Designing Dragons, and hopefully will be out late next year.
Great.
Great.
Check that out.
Thank you. Pop and Play is produced by Haeny and Nathan Holbert, Lalitha Vasudevan, Billy Collins, and Joe Rena Ferry at Teachers College, Columbia University with the Digital Features Institute. This episode was edited by Billy Collins and Adrian Vitullo.
For a transcript and to learn more, visit tc.edu/popandplay. Our music is selections from Leaf Eaters by Poddington Bear, used here under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial License. Blake Danzig and Meyer Clark provided our social media and outreach support. Follow at Pop and Play Pod on Instagram. Thank you to Abu Abdelbaghi for support with our website and additional materials.
Do you teach about play and pop culture? Check out our topics collection organized for the classroom. And of course, don't forget to share Pop and Play with a friend or colleague.
And thanks for listening.